I will stop there and ask for your thoughts, advice. Are there things, perhaps the best slide to go back to is the list of the elements which we had, but is there any of the things which are covered on that slide which is missing? Or if we come back to you at the next meeting with some of these fleshed out, is that what you want to see, or are we missing key elements?
Randy.
Peter, I just have one comment, and if you back up to the wheel, the science supporting adaptive management, I think we're in the age of adaptive management. And it's touched on, but it's not emphasized enough, that scientists, policymakers, and responsible agencies need to all be together at step one. I just don't think that can be emphasized enough, and it's not in the presentation that you've made. I think as you work through that plan, 1 and 2 are critical to have an agreement among the appropriate scientists, policymakers, and responsible agencies as to what the problem is, what we're going to do, and then 3 and 4 become more of a science-oriented research collaboration, and then you come back to 5 and you say, well, this is what we've come up with. Are we on track? Is this going to get what the policymakers are hoping for, and will the agencies be able to effectively and practically implement this? That's that team sport concept. I sound like a broken record, but I think what's been lacking is helping to define the problem early on from the science community. One thing it'll do, it kind of hooks them in at that point. Okay, well, we've defined the problem, so now we've got to help find a solution. We can't just say, well, it requires another study, which is the frustrating part to policymakers. And as I've confessed before, our fault is that we're too quick to try and do something without adequate foundational knowledge to avoid some big mistakes. But emphasize the science involvement at step 1.
I agree with that approach, and I thought it was interesting that the only thing I can find that describes the problem, which the science plan arguably will solve, is in this little handout. And, you look at it and say, current science efforts in the Delta are performed by multiple entities. Now, I assume that is a statement of a problem. And you've got these 11 little bubbles, and probably if you worked at it, you'd get 760 bubbles, and there are probably X thousand of scientists working, and, all on different things. But if you can't, with clarity, describe the problems of the current scientific practices, systems, it's hard to know what should be in a science plan which will allegedly solve the problem. So, for example, and you start off this way, are performed by multiple entities. Okay, to me that suggests that there are 3 options on entities. More entities, less entities, or the same number of entities. I can't think of any variation on that. So presumptively, I would want to see a science plan that says, since it's multiple agencies, I assume you're aiming for less. How many less? And the problem I've got, Peter, is this kind of inclusive framework for conducting science means kind of information sharing and a lot of cooperation and all of that, all of which is probably required by existing law. And everybody thinks they're doing it to the maximum extent possible. But nobody's happy, as best I can tell, with the way science is being conducted in the Delta. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are people who are overjoyed with science, but your quote from Secretary Salazar and Governor Brown suggests some elevation of the importance of science. So, If multiple entities are a problem, what's the solution to multiple entities? If multiple entities, and I assume you mean this as a full thought, they tend to address specific issues which may or may not be related to each other. How are you going to address that? There's no overarching plan. Well, presumably there's a Delta plan coming that might be that. But how do you coordinate research in a structure where 11 or 700 different agencies, groups, individuals, nonprofits, for-profit companies, research institutes, scientific ventures, all are futzing around? I mean, it's too amorphous for me. And I think the statement of the problems that appear in the Delta plan on the current science configuration are more clear than all the stuff you've got here. And for me, if these 11 blobs are the problem, I want to see either no blobs, one blob, or fewer blobs, if that's what you're recommending, so I can understand what in the hell's going on. Or if there are rules like on state and federally sponsored projects in the Delta, they will only consider recommendations after X has done Y. I mean, I can understand that, but I can't understand something where we haven't clearly defined the problem and we're struggling to develop a science plan that is supposed to solve a problem we have yet to define. And I understand how hard it is and controversial, but I wonder whether we aren't just you aren't getting yourself tied into blocks over the practical organizational problems that scientists work for either employers or contracting entities, and each of those employers and contractors entities have their own desire to survive indefinitely, think they are doing everything they possibly can do, want more money to do it, and they want to be left alone. And if I don't know, it's still fuzzy to me. I like one science, one Delta. I don't see a science plan that identifies steps that will lead automatically or hopefully to one Delta, one science. That's what's missing. And I think they're organizational steps. I do not think they are scientific analytical process steps by themselves. It is structure, it's organization, it's the dedication of funding, the routing of funding, it's the requirement of flow of information, and not mentioned in here. But most system operators would trade the current confusing status quo for a scientific involvement that was early and might provide them some assuredness that once they have complied with that structural involvement of meaningful science, that their decision is probably better protected against litigation, political criticism, folks with pitchforks wanting to throw them off the barricades. I mean, that's what they want. They'd like to have some level of certainty. When Mark Cowan says, well, you scientists, tell us, what do the fish need? And I hear, that was a great discussion at the panel, and somebody said, well, you can't answer that. That's a wrong question. Well, hell, that's how people ask that. What do the fish need? And say, well, that's not a scientific question. Well, but it's a human question. So I don't see you've got on the list of the 11 things, institutional and organizational structure for science, but no more than that.
And that's where our thinking is right now. Probably is the most key element.
I'd like to inject something on this, Mr. Chairman. I think this has been just a great discussion, and it's occurred over the course of the last 2 weeks. This has come a long way to end up in maybe a profound conclusion, or maybe just an obvious one from somebody else. But where we're at right now, asking how do we achieve one science, now that we've identified it, really isn't a research question. It's a structural issue of roles and responsibilities that this council holds as well as the other organizations and how best to make them mesh. And so I think this question gets elevated now to another level. There's still other pieces of this, I'm sure, that need to be filled in, but certainly to get to where you want, and I think we all want, which is how do we get there, it's gonna require some other people, I think, and their involvement.
Phil?
Yes, sir.
I look at this and wonder if we shouldn't lower our expectations rather than raise them. There's a lot of scientific expertise and other expertise that is associated or employed by stakeholders, whether it's a BDCP or the Delta water agencies or any of a number of other interests, including environmental. And they utilize the scientific knowledge that they have access to or what they pay for in order to argue their case about some element of the water system and the environment and the Delta. Maybe, Peter, you're the grand umpire, and your job is to find the fairest-minded, smartest, unaffiliated scientists to evaluate the plausibility or accuracy of the representations by different groups that are employing people with scientific knowledge or applied recommendations. And you really advise us and maybe other decision makers or policy makers on that. And so we and others, the public interest writ large, can compare the representations with respect to the scientific validity of a particular proposal, whether it's big like BDCP or whether it's more narrow or smaller or focused, against what you draw upon locally and worldwide. And I think about it that way because I despair of the notion that you can round up the scientists, because they're going to say, Peter, you're not the boss of me. So the independence is such a ingrained and valuable feature of scientists that the prospect of having a group of scientists funneling into a process that will respond on demand to the needs of policymakers seems unlikely. On the other hand, there are plenty of people that want stuff, and they make their proposals, and they utilize scientific information too. And you and other scientists that you include in this process can then tell everyone to what degree that's likely to be accurate or worth following or doesn't have side effects that we wouldn't want to pursue.
Nashia, if I could respond to that, I think that's a very good model, and to a certain extent, the science program does that now. When we convene these independent science panels, and the care and attention we put to selecting the members of those panels is very, very careful. So I think that what you're suggesting as a goal, that could work. To put the counter side to that is, however smart people are that you were to bring in a review panel or whoever sits in this chair, these issues are so complex and so diverse that if we have different entities or interest groups coming with their own pet model, their own data sets, drawing their own conclusions, it's very, very difficult to be objective and say this is better than that, because no model will ever be perfect. What we're thinking in terms of a model is what's been developed in other areas of science, the carbon cycling community, for example, where highly controversial issues. So I think your idea of this oversight, and maybe that's in the shaded boxes or it's out on the sign, absolutely we need that. But we're trying to get everybody up to the same level playing field. And so that if any group is investing a lot of money in refining a model, why not make that model open so that other people can contribute and enhance that model? Because the more people who are engaged in it, the more people who are trained in the use of that model, the more minds that are coming.
Let me give you an example. Is an earthquake going to wreck the water system and the environment by destroying or liquefying a lot of levees in the deltas quickly? Well, there's a lot of reports that say that's a big risk. Then again, there are people in the delta and their engineers that say it's really a low risk. I'd be interested in your monastery of scientific monks looking at it and advising us on the likelihood of one direction or the other being correct and what we should draw from it.
And actually, for a specific question like that, absolutely, that something like that could be done where you look at the data and information that both sides are putting forward. And of course, what will come out is a lot of the uncertainties that are there, which will then help focus more of the science in the future. But for those sort of very specific questions, no, I could see your model absolutely working.
You're going to get the award of the year for the monastery of scientific monks as a description. I wonder whether that Pat's comment isn't a suggestion of an institutional approach that might be used on a science plan alternative. And the approach is to centralize and designate a scientific source, arguably independent of being purchased by interest groups, to whom serious, substantial, or what do you call them, critical questions are assigned, and an answer is hopefully received. That is also consistent with what I would call the extractive model of responsibility. You have multiple agencies, never going to change. You might be able to whack one or two of the tiny ones out, but nobody's ever going to agree to one big science agency that all the various departments and agencies and counties and cities will agree to. But you could, in a place like the Delta, certainly with near-term actions, but ultimately with a BDCP, which is a focused universe of decisions, powers, facilities, mitigation, all of that. You could extract, like in BDCP, from each of the principal government agencies who are a signator to the BDCP process, that they designate their own Delta BDCP lead scientist. And that body collectively becomes a funnel to which information is given and from which arguably decisions are rendered. How you take the governor and the secretary's suggestion that science is going to guide both ecosystem and water exports seems to me likely only through a consolidation of identified individuals for the governmental agencies that are the sponsors of this activity. I'm putting aside the request of the water contractors to be named, whatever in the hell you want to be named in the process, which would arguably give you comparable status to the government agencies, to the federal and state agencies. That's an approach that might, is under the notion of reduced expectation, but identifying who within a multiple agency is the most responsible scientific opiner might be the best you can get out of multiple organizations. But it would not be all that bad. Kind of like the question we're having with the Delta Plan Implementation Committee. Randy's suggestion has got to be the director or the chief deputy director. I mean, a person of high responsibility to make it real. Maybe that's a principle that works in the scientific world too. Doesn't solve all the other problems, but it's at least an approach. I don't know. Randy.
I just tend to focus on application. We talked in the program level as to what a science plan should look like. I tend to want to focus more on what's the outcome, what's the practical application of it. And when I talk about getting a science component involved early on, I'm talking about a particular project. There are a lot of things that we already know that will be included in the science project, like there's not enough food for the fish and we need more shallow water habitat. All right? That's part of the plan. So what do we do about it? Well, we take advantage of opportunities where the elevation in the delta lends itself to this, and we begin to work on it. Well, to me, that's the science plan, is when you actually begin implementing things and doing it differently than we've done it in the past. Atmospheric rivers and seismic vulnerabilities and these things, they're all big issues. Temperature issues and how close are the smelt to extinction and water temperature. These are all big questions, but we can spend another couple of decades talking about those, or wait and see what the outcome is, or we can start doing things now. And I think the real value to a science plan is to make it applicable and make it different than what we've been doing in the past.
Go on. Okay. All right.
Good concepts.
Okay. I want to get Dr. Collier up here for the next part of, as the honest-to-God vice chair of the Independent Science Board, an acknowledged monastery of scientific monks with practical experience.